Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Capital One Bank, the Witkoff Group, Greenberg Traurig. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Aerial Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley and Lardner, Friedman LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, HAP Investment Developers, Herrick Feinstein, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, John Katzimatidis, Red Apple Group, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Massey-Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, MHP Real Estate Services, People's United Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, CUNY TV Foundation, The Moynihan Group, Urban American, and These Friends.
Newark, New Jersey, Sarah Lawrence College, a model, not a model, a Philomena model, okay? A playwright, an author, a restaurateur, a caterer. Who is that? It's my guest today, Norma Jean Darden. Thanks for being here.
It sounds so funny when you say that.
So now, we got to go back to history. Tell us about the two sides of the family. Let's go to the Darden side.
Okay.
Okay, let's go back because the Darden side goes back so interesting to the true entrepreneur, JB.
Oh, absolutely.
So tell me about the Darden side of the family.
Well, they were a very high-spirited group of people. They were boys and girls, and they came from a very humble background. Papa Darden was 9 years old when slavery was abolished and had to make his way in the world, not being able to read or write.
So he was a slave originally.
He was.
He was a slave. He was unable to read or write?
It was against the law to teach them to read or write.
So what happens later on? He does learn to read and write.
Never. He could never do more than put an X for his name.
Now this is the man who became this unbelievable entrepreneur?
Absolutely. He was good with numbers, and he could do it in his head. And in some way, in those first 9 years, he learned carpentry. And that's what led him to make the coffins.
No, so where is he growing up?
North Carolina.
Right.
Never knew a mother or father.
So he's 9 years of age. Slavery is abolished. He becomes a carpenter.
Yes.
And he becomes a carpenter, and from carpentry, he makes caskets.
Caskets. Coffins.
Coffins. And basically wood
Yes.
boxes, okay, nothing fancy, forget the mahogany. And later on, he becomes more of an entrepreneur because the government says you have to bury people.
Yes.
And he becomes an undertaker.
Totally.
Now, he's an undertaker, and how does he meet your mother's side of the family?
Well, when he was 13 years old, he was a raggedy little guy going from town to town, cutting grass, doing odd jobs. And everywhere he went, he would go to the church. And that was the main hub of social intercourse and how people met each other. And my grandmother was serving lemonade, and he thought it was too tart. So he went over to complain that she needed more sugar. And she tell him, I like it like this. And that's what started their little romance.
Now, Grandma has history going back as a Cherokee Indian, you said.
Her mother had a little egg and a poultry store, her mother and father, and her mother was half Cherokee Indian.
Let's continue about Grandpa JB. We have that picture. Undertaker, funeral director, radios. He was selling records.
Yes.
And he talking machines too.
Victor talking machines, which were the
Victrolas.
Victrolas, yes.
So he was truly an entrepreneur.
And he had my father going into the woods, playing these things, and exposing people to them and selling them.
Now, your dad was originally one of 12, but 4 passed away. Your dad goes to Howard, becomes a physician. He has a brother, Uncle who?
John.
Uncle John, who also becomes a
Doctor.
doctor. Then there's another brother who initially starts as a pharmacist. Who's that?
James Benjamin.
And he becomes a physician.
3 doctors.
What do the other boys do and the other sisters?
C.L. and Arthur stayed with the funeral business, and Charles became an attorney.
Now let's go to the mom's side of the family. So tell me about them.
Well, they had a different background. They started in Alabama. And this was so interesting to me because my mother never told us this her entire lifetime. We always thought that her mother and father were the Sampsons. But after she died, we discovered that that was her older sister who had taken her in after her biological mother had died. And that her real father had been a ne'er-do-well owner of a plantation where my grandmother, Corinne, was a cook. So I got cooking, and my sister got cooking in our genes, and we didn't even know it till we were grown women.
Now, you said to me that your mother met your father because it was some relative who said to your father,
James Benjamin.
James Benjamin, it's worthwhile, if you're practicing as a physician, if you want to get female patients, you should be married? What was the story?
Well, he said that men would be more comfortable sending their wives to him if they knew he was married, because he was this very debonair bachelor. And men would be a little cautious about sending their loved ones to him if they didn't know he was stable in himself in a relationship.
You said to me about they burnt the cross, and your father decides it's time to leave the South and to move to Newark, New Jersey.
Yes, my father had intended to practice medicine with his older brother, John, in Opelika, Alabama. But he saw a little kid whose arm was broken and he only had a bandage. And he put a cast on that arm. And the doctor who had put the bandage on asked the little kid how he got a cast. And he said, the new young Dr. Darden. And that guy called up my uncle and he said the town was just too small for him and my very flamboyant father. So they burned a cross on John's lawn, and then John said, it's time for you to go where you'll be freer. And he left in his two-tone Nash. And he said at the time that every stitch of clothing he had been made by black hands at Tuskegee. And he arrived in Newark, New Jersey and established his practice and was there 60 years.
Now, how did he decide on moving to Newark?
Well, Dr. Kinney, another person who had been expelled from Tuskegee, had opened a hospital in Newark, and he went there to work with Dr. Kinney.
Now, your father over there, now your mother was a social worker. She went
Yes.
to Ohio University in Athens, Georgia.
Mm-hmm. She was in Petersburg, Virginia, working at Virginia State, teaching in a rural schoolhouse that was a teaching arm of Virginia State. And my uncle JB was the physician for Virginia State, and he noticed her right away. And the minute my father came to visit, he introduced the two.
Your father moves to Newark, and you were born in Newark, New Jersey.
I was born there.
The older of 2 sisters.
And my sister was born there.
Where were you living in Newark at this time?
On West Kenny Street.
And you said to me it was like next to a Jewish nursing home, and
Absolutely.
then you had an Italian. It was
We
like
had
a.
a Father Divine practitioner on the other side who had a notion shop. And he would always greet us in the morning by saying peace.
And what happens later on? Now you went to public school in Newark originally.
Montclair.
How'd that happen? That you moved out of Newark into Montclair?
Well, we were all very happy and cozy. My father practiced on the first floor, and we lived above his office and had a nice little backyard. And I was very comfortable roaming the streets of Newark. But then they got a threat that someone was going to kidnap me, and they decided Newark really wasn't too safe.
So tell me about growing up in Montclair before you went to boarding school.
Well, it was frightening because I went from the noisy streets of Newark, where I could run around with my little pals, Pinky and Fifi, and got to Montclair, and it was quiet, and there were trees, and I found it extremely frightening. I just preferred living in the city.
Your parents then send you to boarding school.
Yes, to Northfield.
What kind of background? You said it was a
Highly
highly
religious.
religious school.
Yes.
Yes.
We had to attend chapel every day and then work on Saturdays. And my first assignment was cleaning the toilets, and my second was cleaning pots and pans. And I remember my father saying, "Up from slavery," and we're washing pots and pans.
So now you're over there, and how do you decide, since you sound to me like a semi-rebel, that you were going to go to Sarah Lawrence? How'd you make that decision to go to Sarah Lawrence?
Oh, that meant freedom for me. I mean, after this almost oppressive society, it just meant total freedom. And I've never been so happy to be someplace that encouraged you intellectually and let you make your own decisions of what you wanted to study. For me, it was just total freedom, and I encouraged my sister to go there, so we both did.
Now, at Sarah Lawrence, did you know that you wanted to be, at that time, get involved with, become an actress initially at Sarah Lawrence?
I studied the arts there, dance. We had Joyce Trissler and Bessie Schoenberg teaching us, and Charles Carshon in theater. So I was able to explore that and to do some directing myself, and I thought that would be it for me. But after graduation, I found it really hard to establish
So
a career.
now, from Sarah Lawrence, you come into the city and you find an apartment, right? You told
I
me
did.
you had a roommate, and then you moved to the Village or something.
Yes.
You had the Village, and you were trying to break into acting.
Acting.
And what happens later on? How do you become from an actress to become a world-renowned Philomena model?
Well, I was so tall. I was taller than all the leading men, so it was very hard to cast me. Or so they said. I didn't think I was hard to cast. But then I got discovered by while I was selling gloves in Bloomingdale's.
So you didn't tell me about the gloves. How'd you end up in the glove department of Bloomingdale's?
Summer, a Christmas job. You know, if you were trying to act and weren't getting parts, you had to fill in.
You could have been in a restaurant. That's happened later on, but you never did that.
Never
So you're working in
there.
Bloomingdale's.
Yes.
And you're selling gloves. And what happens? Somebody from Black Beauty Agency finds you?
Comes along and says you'd be really good in modeling, and so I thought, well, I'll give that a shot because I'm tall. And I went to see Eileen Ford, and she said I was too heavy, so I lost weight. And then before I could get back with her, Black Beauty came along.
What was this? Black is busting out all over. Tell me what this was.
Well, this was sort of the beginning of a little black revolution in fashion. The designers, John Hagen, Stephen Burrows, Scott Barry, were all coming along with great careers in fashion, and they brought us, the black female model, along with them. And we were doing runway, and it led to print, and in my case, a lot of television commercials. And I was working as an extra in movies at that time, and the fashion picked up, and we were taken to Versailles.
Okay, so this is 69. It's 73. Tell me about Versailles.
Well, by then I was with Wilhelmina. Black Beauty had kind of dissolved, and all of us had dispersed into more major modeling agencies, and Versailles came along. This was the battle between the established French designers and the new American, more sportive designers. There was Halston, Bill Blass, Anne Klein, Oscar de la Renta, and Stephen Burrows. And the French had an elaborate show with the semi-nude girls from the salon there, and they had Nureyev, who just could do enormous kicks and elevation, and they had a very exciting show, and Grace Kelly was there, and Josephine Baker, who just wowed us all. And they went on and on for almost 2 hours. The shows were so long, with Yves Saint Laurent and all the top couturiers. And then the little Americans came along, and our scenery didn't fit, so we had none. And I remember the music of Barry White, and we came out and just stunned them by our theatricality and the garments that we wore. So recently, we have been feted and honored as bringing American fashion to Europe. Before, it was always the French that set the pace, and we made a little wedge so that American
we have that
fashion
picture over here.
went through. Absolutely.
So it's 74, and there's this, you had a health issue, and you continued modeling. And you're supposed to be on the cover of Essence magazine.
Yes.
And what happens with this Vogue editor?
Oh, well, that was, for me, it was really the worst part of my life, because I was set to do the cover of Essence and to do a Vogue shooting, and I got acute peritonitis and nearly died. And my father came to the hospital, and he said, "Daughter, I don't think there's too much future in running up and down the sidewalk in an evening gown. You better start thinking of a more solid career." And I agreed, because I said I didn't want my tombstone to read, "Here died a model," and I wanted to start a business.
So how was the idea to create a cookbook, especially since you never cooked?
Yes.
There was no cooking.
And I wasn't eating either.
Okay, that's right. You were always trying to be anorexic.
Yes.
So how does the idea, who created this little...
The Vogue editor, who was the food editor, Maxine McKendry, asked me what my background was. And when I told her that I was indigenous American, part Indian, I'd had a grandfather who was a slave, and I'd had some, as my mother told me, Irish blood, I was very American. And she said, out of the blue, "Well, you must have a fabulous cookbook." I went, "Cookbook?" It made no sense. But I told my sister this, and she said...
The non-rebellious Sarah Lawrence graduate,
Yes.
a social worker,
Right.
who went to a Quaker school, yes. And
And she said she'd actually had a dream that we were working on something together, and it was her only prophetic dream, because we did come together and work 7 years to produce this book.
so talk to me how you produced this book. You went down south, and you interviewed relatives.
We did.
Spoonbread and Strawberry Wine. Now, how do you come up with the title?
The first 2 recipes we got. My father told us how my grandfather used to make wine for church, and that he didn't really drink it except at church. And his favorite was strawberry wine. And on my mother's side, her grandmother made spoonbread, which was my favorite thing growing up.
Now, so the book is really a family history and some a lot of recipes.
And photographs.
And photographs. And what was interesting was this was you were modeling at this time, your sister,
Yes.
social work, but this was a labor of love.
Indeed.
So what happens with regard to this book later on? When it comes out, it's the first cookbook with a history, right? You were saying?
Yes, and photos.
So what happens to Channel 13?
Well, after the cookbook came out, we toured and had a book tour. And we came back, and a friend of mine got nominated for an Academy Award. And she worked at Channel 13. They gave her a potluck party, and I brought a very simple quiche to the party. And the party event planner, loved my quiche. So she called up and asked if I would do a party at Channel 13. And I said, no, we really hadn't planned to do anything like
Was the
that.
quiche in the recipe book also? Or this was, I didn't think it was from the South. Huh?
No, very French. And then she said, well, you know, we have $5,000 for this. And I went, we'll do it.
So-
and that was the beginning
So that was the
of our
beginning of the
catering.
catering business.
Absolutely.
And so what year does the catering business start? Like 84?
Yes.
So this is your sister and you in the catering business. And over the years that the catering business has done major events. It did David Dinkins' inauguration. It's done major parties and so on. But then you decide, I want to go back into theater.
Yes.
So how does the play come about?
Well, Win Handman suggested that we take the book and turn it into a one-woman show. And I didn't know how we would do it, but he took me to a workshop that he was doing to develop plays. And I was in the workshop for 6 weeks, and we developed a play, and we presented it 10 minutes. And then he thought we should expand it, and it was totally his idea.
So how long was the play? And it was a one-woman play where you acted out the roles of the relatives.
Well, yes, it was a storytelling piece, and then we would cook as I told the stories, and during the intermission we would eat together, me and the audience.
It was here for about 6 months at the
6 months at the American Place Theater on 46th Street.
And then after that it went on the road to a couple.
To the Invisible Theater in Tucson, Arizona, and to the Freedom Theater in Philadelphia. And I was all set to do more tours, but I was losing my catering business.
So you had the catering business at this time. You're in the theater business.
Yes.
And, you know, you, as they would say, it's hard to be catering when you're on the road.
Absolutely.
Over there. So then you decide to go back into the catering business full time.
Yes, I had to curtail my
Now,
touring.
the catering business, you said, originally was out of your home.
Yes.
So later on, the catering business gets into a store
Yes.
up on Morningside Avenue.
On 110th Street.
And you're in the store where you're doing the catering, and what happens? The landlord says, the Avon ladies moving?
They were my neighbors, and they moved out. And he said, why don't you take this space and make a restaurant? And I said, well, I've never thought about that. And I said, no. And he said, okay, well, I'll take the guy who'll make it a laundromat. And I said, okay. And then he said the laundromat man backed out, and another caterer was moving in. And I said, oh, no, that won't do. I'll open a restaurant.
The restaurant business is a full-time job. You know, there's 2 meals a day, definitely, because you, as my friend Shelley Fireman said, you can't make it on 1 meal a day, so you try to do. So the first restaurant is this 45-seat restaurant called?
Miss Mamie's, Spoonbread 2.
And that is located?
On 110th Street, right next to the catering business.
And basically the food is most of the food from the recipes?
Yes.
Now you said to me, what happens is since it had 40 seats, a lot of these buses would come, people would want to come up, and the buses held 55 people.
And
so what happened? The
them.
10 others, they had to be outside? They weren't allowed to come into the restaurant?
Well, they would pass me by. So I couldn't have that. So we opened up Miss Maud in Central Harlem on 138th Street and Lenox Avenue.
And when is Ms. Maud open up?
2 years after Miss Mamie's.
Are you cooking or are you just supervising?
Well, by this time, I'm doing bringing the business in, and my sister's doing all the baking. She does the biscuits and the muffins and the spoon bread and the cornbread and the coconut cake and the banana pudding, the sweet potato pies, and
that's made.
cobbler.
That's made in the
Daily.
in the restaurant, or
Yes.
Now is the catering business still there?
Yes. Oh, yes.
So
We've had a distinct honor of serving 3 presidents. We did Obama's book party when that came out. We've had Bill Clinton visit the restaurant 4 times and catered for him and for Hillary. And we actually worked for Bush.
how is it to be the restaurateur? You said to me you also had a short stint on TV.
Yes, very too short. We did a pilot for a cooking show before cooking shows were really popular, and Eartha Kitt was our guest.
Really? So what kind of cooking was this? This is before the Food Network, I would assume.
Yes, oh, it was. We were ahead of our time, I'm afraid.
And what do you see now? What's the next stage of your career? Because I mean, to follow JB and the family over there, he was selling Victrolas. He was
Yes,
selling
everything.
Do you want to come out with another cookbook?
Well, we have been working on a new cookbook, a more modern version of what the old one had. And I've had a wonderful run at Dizzy's Club Coca-Cola.
Right. You said, what do you do at
Yes.
Dizzy's?
I am the menu consultant for GP and for Wynton Marsalis at Dizzy's. And that has been wonderful and challenging. And I've been there 9 years.
Now, do you bring in the food from the
No,
restaurant?
no, the food is cooked on premise. And my next step, of course, are products. We have interesting hot sauces, and we want to get our products on the market. So that's it.
You know, for the family who started in many entrepreneurial businesses, for the granddaughter of the slave who couldn't sign his name, and who's had a very successful family, I would say that you and your sister and the entire Darden Sampson has been a very interesting story, and I'm very happy that you were here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.